A basketball hero around here is treated like a god. I mean, how can you ever find out what he could really do? I don't want this to be the high point of his life. I've seen them, the real sad ones. They sit around the rest of their lives talking about the glory days when they were 17 years old.
You know, most people would kill to be treated like a god just for a few moments.
Welcome to Keeping the Nostalgia Alive, the Indiana Basketball Memory Show. I am your host, Billy Powell. Hopefully you're listening to this on Keeping the Nostalgia Alive. That's all one word, keepingthenostalgiaalive.podbean.com. We are also on Spreaker, and within the summary of this show that we're getting ready to do today, I will also put the Spreaker link also. You can also go to HoosierHysteria.net and listen. If you are on keepingthenostalgiaalive.podbean.com, you can also thumb through over 160 interviews of Indiana high school basketball greats, Coach Gene Cady, Rick Mount, Kent Benson. The list goes on and on. If you played, coached, officiated, or just had a special relationship with the game of basketball, you'll find something on there you'll be able to listen to and download and listen at your leisure. So this upcoming basketball season in Indiana high school basketball, 2019-2020, is a special one, especially for the Loogootee Lions, and that is their 50th anniversary of going to the Final Four at, I think it was still Butler Fieldhouse at the time before they changed it to Hinkle Fieldhouse. I'm interviewing a few players from that team. And one of those players, he was a manager at the time and then played the following year, so the team must have been really stacked, is John Olsen. John, thank you for taking some time out of your busy day to help keep the nostalgia alive and talk about your basketball career and your passion for the game. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Billy. Glad to be on.
So tell us a little bit about where you were born and raised, brothers and sisters. Did your mom and dad play basketball, and when were you first introduced to this game?
I am a stranger in a strange land where basketball is concerned. I was born in upstate New York near Buffalo, moved to Indiana when I was 3-4 years old. I don't believe that my parents played any team sports. I like to say that for my dad, a team sport was two people fishing. I first ran into basketball as a first grader at Loogootee Elementary School. An interesting thing about that was probably 3/4 of the kids I started school with, I went to school through 12th grade. Not much moving in and out. Had some native Hoosiers in that class, and they were playing some basketball. I can clearly remember not knowing any of the rules of the game. In fact, some of the guys in my class, starting out, had older siblings who play. And just to give you an example of things I didn't understand about basketball, I couldn't understand why we played that the high school team played the same opponent all the time. They played a place called Var City. Var City's playing tonight. We're playing Var City. I'm going to the Var City game. I didn't realize it was the Var City game. So, yeah, I remember playing on the playground once, and a friend of mine I had the ball. I was probably a 4th or 5th grader. He was jumping up and down on defense, kind of like a monkey, and so I jumped up and down a couple times with the ball, and they called travel on me. I had no idea that was a rule. So, have an older sister. Didn't play any sports. An older brother who ran track, and a younger sister who wasn't in sports. And I would say that sports had the right place in our family. I didn't get any break because I was in sports. If I didn't get things done, there was always, I would say, not a threat. There was always the promise that if you don't keep your grades, you don't do this, that, or the other, you're going to miss practice. You're going to be, so. That was kind of my biological family background. But I grew up across the street from Rex Sager. Rex Sager is a year older than me, was a starter on that 1970 Final Four team, played 4 years of college basketball. He was probably a head taller than everybody in his class all the way through school. And he became my, I guess you would say, sports brother. He was better at everything. He was a catcher in baseball, center on the basketball team. He was really more of my doorway into sports than anybody else. And then, as I got into junior high, I started playing basketball. In fact, I kind of laugh. My kids started playing basketball in kindergarten. At Loogootee at the time, basketball started in 7th grade. They did reach down and picked out four sixth graders when I was a 6th grader, and I was one of them. The other 3 had played basketball a lot, had siblings who played. I think they picked me because I could take instruction. I had good hands. I was well coordinated. And we played, so I played 2 years of 7th grade basketball at 6th grader and 7th grader. And then played up until I wasn't going to be good enough to play my junior year, which you alluded to. I was a manager on the 70 team and a player on the 71. So that's the long answer to your question about some background.
Well, it was a loaded question. It was a long question also. So did you have, was baseball one of your sports that you liked to play before kind of getting basketball underneath your belt?
Well, I think I would say I'm a so-so athlete, but I think I may have 10 varsity letters. Track. We had a no-cut track, no-cut cross country. So I was a runt, Billy. When I was about 5'2" or 5'4" when I was a freshman in high school, weighed 102 pounds. The only thing that might predict some size, I think my shoe size was size 12 or 13 at the time. I think my legs got strong just by lifting those heavy shoes with every step. But since we had no cut track and cross country, I participated in those. I wasn't the slowest at the distances, but that's where freshmen got stuck if they didn't have a specialty. So you got to walk before you run and run before you do anything else. And I really got my start in sports, I think, in track and cross country. Although I did play freshman baseball, I'll tell you the kind of baseball player I was. I don't believe we had a JV team. I don't even know if we have a freshman team, but just to give you the idea, I didn't start. When I would get up to bat, I'd step out of the box. I'd look down at third base. They'd give me the take sign, strike 1. Step out of the box, look down at third base. They'd give me the take sign, strike 2. I'm not sure they didn't give me the take sign on the third strike too. So baseball wasn't going to be in my future. So I think I just had one letter in that, but I believe I may have lettered 4 years in track and cross country, and eventually became our second best cross country runner behind Tony Smith, who was a starter on the 1970 team, starting guard. Second best cross country runner to him, and in track, I was probably the second highest point winner. I high jumped, I long jumped, and then I would run 2 races, either the mile and the mile relay, or the 880 yard and the mile relay. Basketball, I played freshman ball. Somewhere really early in the freshman season, somebody on the JV flunked off, so I moved up to the JV. Played when I say played, I worked hard in practice. I wasn't a particularly good player. If enough people were sick, I might get a start. But for the most part, my freshman and sophomore years, I didn't play a lot of JV. I was on the team. I guess to jump into that 1970 season and my part of it, after my sophomore year in high school, or late that year, I should explain that Loogootee was the smallest town in Indiana to have 2 Indiana High School Athletic Association sanctioned basketball programs or basketball schools. Loogootee was a town of about 2,500. Loogootee St. John's, a Catholic school, was an IHSAA school, and Loogootee high school or the public school, we each had basketball programs. St. John's, I believe, in the 68-69 season, I believe had an undefeated regular season and had a kid who went on to play for Bob Knight at Army and John O'Malley. Jack Trout played college ball. They had a really good team. And Loogootee had a good team. Rex Sager, I've mentioned before, was going to be a college player. Tony Smith played in college. Brian Canada, Loogootee's all-time leading scorer still, played in college. So there were two really good teams. And late my sophomore year, Loogootee St. John's High School burned down. There may be some factual inaccuracy, but I'm not lying. I've just forgotten. They burned down, and I believe by this time the public school had moved into a new building, and I believe St. John's may have moved into the old Loogootee High School. That school burned down. So there was a small stretch probably in early 1969 in the spring, I think, where there were two schools under one roof. I believe that St. John's and Loogootee Public School were both in the new high school building, but totally separate. We didn't integrate the classes because it was too late in the school year. So I'm looking forward to my junior year where I might get I should make the varsity. Typically at Loogootee, if you didn't make the varsity your junior year, you were cut. If you weren't good enough to play as a junior or make the team, you were cut. So all of a sudden, I've got a lot of kids coming from St. John's to compete with, and the only way I could see that I would make the 1969-1970 Loogootee High School basketball team was as a manager. So that's what I did. I told the coaches I was going to be a manager. Nobody said, "Oh, no, you'll make the varsity, you'll play." So I was a manager that year. From time to time, if there weren't enough players to practice as a JV, and when I say from time to time, I'm going to guess maybe 10 times total in the season, I dressed and I practiced, played defense with the JV when they practiced. But otherwise, I was washing jocks and picking up towels and getting water and cleaning, cleaning basketballs. I don't know how our basketballs got so dirty, but it seemed like Coach Butcher, anytime he saw us kidding around or just standing, we ended up cleaning basketballs. So that's kind of how I got on the 1970 team as a manager.
I think you're probably my seventh or eighth Loogootee Lion that I've got to chat with. Bill Butcher, Junior G, the list goes on. And, every time they've talked about the burning down of the St. John's School and then, of course, the other school, and I've never asked this question, what was behind that? Was both accidental fires?
As far as I know, it doesn't. You don't have to look far to find a conspiracy theorist. that the fires were set intentionally, especially the second one, because St. John's had no place to go, and they were in a building that the public school had just vacated because it was out of date. So I've certainly heard that it may have been intentional, but I've never gone there. They seemed like accidents to me. One of the things I'll tell you, and I'm going to use Rex Sager and Jim Trout. Jim Trout was he was a really good player at Loogootee at St. John's. Would have been their star in 1969, 1970. Rex Sager, Jim Trout was about 6'6". Rex Sager, 6'5", heavier built, more rugged player, would have been Loogootee's star in the 1969-70 for Loogootee Public School. So you've got, if you want to look at it this way, you've got forced integration, forced by fire. You've got the Catholic school and the public school are forced together, and Rex and Jim, and I don't know that they consciously took on this role, and it may be just me looking at it this way, they became the symbol for how those two schools were going to come together, and in a sense, how two parts of town would come together. The people who supported the public school and the people who supported the private school, the Catholic school. From my perspective, it couldn't have gone better. I didn't see any jealousy or rivalry between those two. Rex played under the basket. Jim played a little farther away. Statistically, Jim had a better year. Had Rex not been there, statistically, I don't think Jim would have had as good a year, because if someone came out to guard Jim, he would dump it off to Rex, and Rex had made, the drop step move and layups and short shots all his life, rebounded, so on and so forth. So as soon as basketball practice started, something good was happening, and once the team started winning, we're talking about Indiana basketball. We're talking about the movie Hoosiers about 15 years later. It was that way. Everything shut down for the ball games. We had a tremendous following at home and on the road. And I always look at those two guys as kind of the face of that team. They were the most prominent seniors. We still had Brian Canada, who was a sophomore that year, who was the all-time leading scorer. I believe Jim Trout was the leading scorer that particular year. We had Tony Smith, who was going to go on to college and was, I would say, the team leader the next year. But however those buildings burned and those schools came together, I think you can look back at Jim Trout and Rex Sager as two people who shaped the future of a school, a program, and a town.
I don't think that I would be doing what I'm doing now if I wasn't a manager at Broad Ripple High School. And, I wasn't a very good basketball player, but I just had a passion for the game, and I was like a sponge. Did you feel like you got what was your mentality like? Did you feel like you were a sponge, that 69-70 season? Did you, and also too, did you, I'm making another long question for you. Did you feel like, I have to take everything in because I'm going to play the following year?
I would say then, and looking back in retrospect, I think I'm accurate saying this, that I was about as dumb as a rock. I followed. That was the good thing about being a guy on the end of the bench. Coach told me to do something, and I did it. I didn't have parents. Well, I didn't have parents that interfered in any way, shape, or form. They didn't complain about playing time. They didn't talk to the coach about anything. I just did, what was expected. I went on to play a year of college basketball in the Big Ten as a walk-on with a coach who really stressed the mental part of the game. Probably 5 or 6 years after that, so now I'm in my early 20s. Well, let's say go to the mid-20s. I remember playing a pickup game one day, Billy. I was playing against a guy that I knew well. If he got the ball underneath the basket, he was going to score. So I had to deny him the ball. And all of a sudden, I realized everything that was going around me in I can tell you the gym, I can tell you the basket, but just in great detail. I saw somebody with the ball. I knew where the next pass was going. And all of a sudden I thought, this is what Coach Butcher in high school was talking about all the time. This is what the coach in college was talking about all the time. Mentally, it took me a long time to get what a lot of other players, Tony Smith, our point guard, he could bring the ball down the court and probably had that clarity for years and made decisions, right then, things that I didn't reach that level of thought till I was in my mid-20s, I would say. In fact, I'll tell you, we used to videotape games, and we videotaped some B-team games. I've used junior varsity earlier, but we called it the B-team because it definitely was. So when we ran a play, I ran the play. Okay, so guard brings it down. I pop out from the block to the wing. They pass me the ball. I don't know if my defensive man died, went to get popcorn or whatever, but I have a clear lane to the basket. I'm 15 feet out. There's nobody between me and the basket. So of course, I made the next pass in the offense. Everybody laughed because this is what you want. You want to be wide open. I could have dribbled in for a layup. But for me, you're in there to run, especially during garbage time when I got in, you were in there to run the offense. You had plenty of guys who would freelance and shoot, so I made the next pass. So I was just a rigid, step by step by step. Now, looking back, I learned a lot of the mental lessons. I learned about, mental discipline and what the coaches were trying to get through. I benefit tremendously from basketball, but more later and off the court and the mental aspects than I did from while I was playing, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes total sense. On your way to Loogootee your freshman year, was there already a status for Coach Butcher? Did you know what you were getting into? Had you met him before? Did you go to a lot of the games before you actually even got to Loogootee High School?
Yeah, I went to games in junior high because they were social events. I certainly watched the games, but they were more. We were in a gym quite like some of the ones depicted in Hoosiers. The bleachers came down so close to the sideline that if you had size 12 or larger shoes, you had to turn your shoes sideways to be able to keep out of bounds to throw the ball in, because your heels were against the bleachers and your toes would have been on the sideline. So the high school kids were downstairs. There was a balcony around three sides of the gym upstairs, and that's where the junior high kids were, and especially there was a high set of bleachers. So, yeah, I went to the ball games. We knew, Loogootee was successful already. Loogootee had been successful, I'm going to say, with Coach Butcher as a coach. He was a very good high school basketball player. He played in college at Memphis State. In those days, there was the National Invitation Tournament. The NCAA didn't have a postseason tournament. The NIT was the big tournament, and I believe Memphis State went to the Final Four in Madison Square Garden. Coach Butcher was drafted by the Celtics, but he was also drafted by the U.S. Army, and you can kind of guess where that one went. So Coach Butcher was a great player and came back to coach, so I think there were great expectations. But the first ball player I remember hearing about was Junior G. Junior G, by the way, in the 1960 or 68-69 season, was the coach at St. John's. And it was interesting that as small as our town was, 2,500 people, St. John's and the public school, we did not play each other in the regular season.
Interesting.
Ponder on that however you want. But we didn't play each other. So Junior G was ahead of his time. Dribbled between the legs, dribbled behind the back, made what most coaches at the time would have considered fundamentally unsound passes, except that the passes got where they were supposed to get. And I think for Coach Butcher, it became this guy was extremely talented. So yeah, there were Loogootee always had winning records. Loogootee won sectionals, but Loogootee had never won a regional going into that 69-70 season, partly because Washington, Indiana was 15 miles away. Washington had a much bigger school. We could get out of the Washington sectional, but that was, I think, fairly rare. Then we would go on to the regional, and there were even bigger teams. It wasn't until 69-70 that Loogootee won their first regional under Coach Butcher. So the expectations were always were high, and tell you the truth, the expectations were high for the 69-70 team even before the Fires forced St. John's to add to the team.
Was it all Loogootee that was going on in your mind as a child that age in basketball, or did you kind of step back and were you a fan, or what was going on in the rest of the state with Indiana high school basketball?
I would say that our interest, and I'm saying this for the team, didn't go past our opponents or our conference. It wouldn't be unusual if we had a chance to, if we played a Friday night and a future opponent played a Saturday, we'd go to the Saturday game to see a future opponent. First time I drove a car, got my license and drove a car out of town, Tony Smith and Rex Arvin, who was a good friend of mine, and also what I call a deep sub, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 man on the bench. the three of us drove to Worthington to see Worthington play somebody we were going to play down the road. That was my first time driving out of town. So our interest didn't go much beyond who was playing in our little area. And you got to remember, Loogootee was one of the first schools to consolidate in 69, 70, 71, right along there. There were a zillion little towns. So, we didn't play any farther away than maybe 25 miles away. It wasn't like, my son played in Terre Haute, and Terre Haute played 100 miles away in Evansville and 70 miles away in Indianapolis, and traveled all over to find another school as big as they were. We didn't have any trouble finding comparable competition. So, as the team progressed through the tournament, then we took interest. We didn't have any idea what Seymour had going into the semi-state, but by the time they were playing Seymour, we knew they were undefeated and ranked second in the state. When they played in the state finals, they knew that Carmel, our opponent, had a guy who was certainly going to be Mr. Basketball in David Shepard. So no, we were fans of Loogootee, and we had an interest in our conference and our opponents, and I would say that was about it.
At the beginning of that 69-70 season, as a junior, did you foresee or think how good you guys would become, or did you see the success or even going to the Final Four that year?
Well, not the Final Four. You got to understand, and this is just demographics. Town the size of Loogootee, you're not going to have, I think, 6'3", 6 feet 3 inches, I believe, is about the 95th or 97th percentile in height. We had Rex Sager. We had a guy that was 6'5". That was unusual. And then we had Brian Canada, who was 6'2". So, oh my gosh, we've got two big guys. Well, we had Jim Trout, who's 6'6". And all of a sudden, if you look at the successful small high school teams, and I'm going to say Southern Indiana, they had big kids. And it just happened, that was a year that they had one or two big kids. So that was really that portended great things. That we had guards, experienced guards, and Tony Smith and Paul Bruner coming back. That was positive. We had a 6'3" kid, Mike Lannon, on the bench. We had probably Bernie Nante was over 6 feet. So we had physically one of the biggest teams that you could imagine. It wasn't until they started winning and winning and winning and winning. They were 24-4. So going into the state finals, you win 8 out of every 9 games. Yeah, well, that gives you an idea that you're pretty good. Then you win your first regional. That gives you an idea that you're pretty good. It just kind of, by that time there wasn't. By the time they went to the semi-state, there really wasn't time to stand back and look. It was the next opponent was coming up. Everybody wanted to talk to the players. Just the hoopla involved was tremendous. So now, Coach Butcher had the ability to see several quarters ahead in a game, several games ahead in the season, and he could probably see several seasons ahead in a kid's career. So if you asked him the same question, he might, if he wasn't being overly modest, I don't know that he would say semi-state, but I would think that he felt that he had a real good chance of winning his first regional. He's just too smart to have not thought that.
And tell us from the manager's perspective, what kind of, and a player's perspective, what kind of support system did you guys have? Tell us a little bit about your fan base and everybody that supported you. Was it, was it, you understand my question?
Oh, yeah, I definitely. Well, I'm gonna make a comparison to when my wife grew up about 7 miles away from Loogootee and went to another small school, Bar Reef High School, which probably has one of the premier Class A programs now. When she and I moved to Terre Haute, just because we both had been basketball fans, we went to one of the big high schools in Terre Haute to watch a game, and we were surprised that the gym was half full. Then we started asking people around us about the various players who were out on the floor, and they didn't know the players. And that was that the gyms weren't full and that you weren't on a first-name basis with the players. We knew we weren't in Kansas anymore. You know, it was a real different environment for us. Loogootee was so small, everybody knew everybody. You know, the players didn't get in trouble because somebody was going to see them get in trouble. The player's success, that was the town's success. The player got hurt, the town got hurt. So basketball was the number one entertainment and diversion in Loogootee, I would say. And so the town was 100% behind the kids, and the kids were good kids. They liked the kids. They were leaders. They were popular. You know, if a kid was a rat playing basketball at Loogootee, they probably didn't play basketball at Loogootee for very long. They dropped out. So fan support was tremendous. You know, we had just moved into a new gymnasium, one of the last of its kind, which is the top of the bleachers are at ground level. It's a bowl, and the gymnasium is built. The gym floor is, I don't know how many feet below ground level. It was a cheaper way to build a gym, and that's why it was built that way. Somebody told me recently, but we had everything we needed, you know, from the athletic. Well, we had tremendous athletic department support, and I don't know if Coach Butcher, the basketball coach, was athletic director then, but eventually he became athletic director. So we had tremendous support, tremendous community support, pictures of the ball players and pictures of the team in business windows. When they went to the sectional, you know, there were grease paint signs in all the windows, "Go Lions," on and on and on. And it just built and built and built as they progressed through the tournament. So it was a rare person who didn't know much or have much interest in Indiana, in Loogootee basketball. And I will say that my dad was one of those rare people. He grew up in the North Woods in northern Wisconsin. Didn't get the Hoosier hysteria. I'm not sure he came to my games when I was a senior and was playing, and that certainly wouldn't have been lack of interest in what I was doing. It just was not an activity it wasn't life and death to him like it was to a lot of people. But otherwise, you know, just tremendous community support. That's the short answer, Billy.
In 69-70, you guys are getting ready to start the tournament. As a manager, do you step back and do you remember and have great memories of getting to that Final Four? Are there any stories that stick out to you and share with us?
Yeah, I'll tell you the first story, and I recently talked to Tony Smith about this and to Wayne Flick, who was a freshman, I believe, at the time. No, he may have been an eighth grader at the time. And so my facts aren't 100% accurate on this, but one of the things I remember is going into the tournament, coaches submitted a roster. You had 12 players, and they were your 12 best players. If I remember correctly, there was a senior. I'm going to name names, and he'll forgive me if I'm inaccurate, but Richie Arvin was a senior. Not particularly, it wasn't tall. There was a younger player who probably played up varsity some. I think, anyway, I don't think Richie made the sectional roster, and I think there was a little discontent. I think some of the other senior players, especially Richie, was a senior. He didn't play on the sectional team, I don't believe. A younger, legitimately more talented kid took his place. I don't know what happened. I don't know if there's an injury or what happened, but Richie was back on the team for the regional, semi-state, and state finals. So that was my first memory was getting the roster back to the way it should have been. So I've had several, like I said, I looked at a picture after I talked to Tony Smith a couple of months ago. my memory may be totally off, but that was the first memory. So we win the sectional. You know, in those days, there wasn't the strict 180 days of school. You win the sectional, you win the sectional, you come straight back from the gym at Washington to the gym at Loogootee, and there's a huge rally. This is going to be, by this time, 9:30, 10 at night, didn't matter what time it was. The whole town shows up. All the fans show up, and the players and the coach, they all take the microphone. Everybody cheers whatever they say. And then the superintendent or the principal of the high school says, no school on Monday. That was a celebration. All right. Of course, the team starts, right back to practice Monday. Practices all through the week. Win the regional, come back from Washington, which is where the regional was held, I believe. No school on Monday again. Win the semi-state. That was played in Evansville, and I can't imagine that we got back to the gym before 11 o'clock at night, maybe even closer to midnight. The gym is packed with people, the fans, students. It was either 2 days off or 3 days off of school. By this time, when Loogootee won the semi-state, they won by 2 points. They beat the number 2 ranked Seymour Owls. Seymour was undefeated. There were state media outlets that my understanding said that they would say, well, we have a score here, but we don't know that it's correct. It shows little Loogootee upsetting number 2 ranked Seymour. We'll have to get back and verify that score. It was such an upset that I remember there's a headline, Loogoowho, Logooowho, not Loogootee, but Loogoowho beats Seymour. By that time, then the press descends. We're a rural community, but I think I counted up once. I think of the 12 players on the team, there were 3 who actually lived on farms. But of course, the press has to play that up and show Smitty with one of his cows, and emphasize the whole rural aspect of Loogootee, where Carmel, of course, is probably the most affluent city in Indiana, and probably was then. The joke back in those days was a kid from Carmel got grounded by having the phone taken out of their car. They wouldn't get grounded from their cars; they would all have cars. And to have a mobile phone. Mobile phones are about the size of a shoe or a shoe box back then. So the press had to make the whole David and Goliath thing. But it was a great week, and when we walked into, I think we called it Hinkle Field House. You said in the intro it was on the campus at Butler, but Tony Hinkle was around then. You could be right. I mean, you're from the Indy area, from Indy. I just remember walking in that. It was the same as walking into Roberts Stadium in Evansville the week before. These were massive places. They were just massive. It was really special. The next day, in the state finals to play, it was another ball game. Once the game started, it was just another ball game. And I don't know if the players looked at it that way or not, but they were years and years ahead of me in terms of mental maturity. And I can't imagine those guys being too overwhelmed by playing in Indianapolis against Carmel.
So 15 years later, the movie Hoosiers comes out. Did it bring back a lot of memories? Did you feel like you almost lived the Hoosier type storyline?
Absolutely. The gyms were familiar. By that time, I played from 6th grade through maybe 9th or 10th grade. I can't remember when we got out of that old gym, but we still, there were some days that the JV would go down there and practice, or the junior high. Those were the gyms out of Hoosiers. I mean, some of the towns that we had just stopped playing Olytic. I think Hickory played Olytic in the movie. Olytic became Bedford North Lawrence because consolidation was still starting. Somebody told me that before all the cuts were made, that Loogootee was mentioned someplace in the movie Hoosiers. The writer and director, who were two fraternity brothers at IU, came to Terre Haute just a couple of years ago, and it was an evening of those guys being interviewed. They had a couple of the actors, one of the referees and one of the subs on the team. They were interviewed and talked about the movie, and then they showed the movie. Yeah, it was very much like growing up. The barbershop scene, that was Bob and Brownie's barbershop. Bob Cox, his daughter was a cheerleader who married Brian Canada. Brownie, I can't even remember, his last name was Brown. I can't even remember his first name, but that's where Coach Butcher got his haircut. Every once in a while, I'd be in there to get a haircut. When Coach Butcher would come in, they didn't quite genuflect and kneel, but everything got quiet, and everybody listened to every word that came out of Coach Butcher's mouth. That was it was just like Hoosiers. So yeah, and there was a movie that came out, an independent film called Kings of the Court. I don't know if you've heard of this one. This was based on Bar Reeves' state championship a year or two ago. It followed the team for a season. Even though 50 years had passed, nearly 50 years, it was still the same experience. A small school, what it meant to the town, where the kids came from. Yeah, it was quite like Hoosiers.
What was Coach Butcher like to you as a manager, and then the following year, what was Coach Butcher like to you as a coach? And what is Coach Butcher like to you now?
Scared of him. Well, he was an authority. He was an authority figure. He was quite good at what he did. He was the absolute, undisputed leader of the gym, of the team. You did what he said. I was, a deep sub really never gets the wrath of the coach. But my friend Rex Sager, yeah, he and Coach Butcher went around, and Coach Butcher, he had, I'd say harsh words, but he had correction for people, and if people had a hearing problem or a listening problem, he could ratchet the volume up. He didn't like to say things twice if he didn't have to. So I say fear, but I'm going to say respect underlying all of that. My junior year, a manager, I mean, you were a manager, you're on the team, but you can't score a point for the team. Although I know you did as a manager. You need to interview yourself someday. As a manager, he expected us to eliminate any obstacle to that might cause a player distraction. A good manager is only noticed when they screw up. And when they do things right, everything runs right, and it's all about the team. So, we knew what was required of us, and we did it. Now, but here's my favorite, or a couple of my favorite Coach Butcher stories. When I was a senior, and I was back on the team, and we were approaching fall break, Coach Butcher told us in no uncertain terms that too many people had been missing practice for college visits. Too many people had been missing practice. And when I say missing practice, if you had a starter miss one practice, that was too much. He said the next person who missed practice was going to be off the team. And I'm sitting on the fact that fall break starts in a couple of days, and my church has elected me from my youth group to go to Washington, D.C. and New York over fall break, and I would be missing several practices. So there are several layers to this story. I think today a kid in my place would have gone home and had their parent come in and talk to the coach about it. But that wasn't the way sports were in those days. Sports taught you to think for yourself. And so he just said the next person to miss practice is off the team. Within 15 minutes, there was a break in practice. He went back to his office, and I followed him. And I said, Coach, here's my dilemma. I'm gonna have to miss practice. And without a pause, that's fine. That's fine. It's a church-related activity. He says, I'm talking about the guys who are taking, paraphrasing, these bogus college trips, who are missing practice for no good reason. He couldn't have been more gracious about that. Awesome. Another Coach Butcher story. My senior year, the custom on senior night is the senior start. We had 6 seniors. I had the least tenure on the team. Rex Arvin, mentioned earlier, a buddy of mine, probably did play JV as a junior. They did some odd things because of the consolidation. Rex Arvin had played, we had 5 seniors who had been on the team longer than me, so I didn't start. This is the one time that I had a parent who was livid. My mother was just, I felt like I was going to have to hold her back from finding the coach. She was so upset that not only did I not get to start, I didn't get to play. Well, the reason I didn't get to play is you can never count on Shoals, your cross-county rival. We played Shoals the first game of the season. I scored 4 points. We beat them handily at their place, and when they came to our place later in the season, we won narrowly. I didn't expect to play as close as the game was. It didn't bother me at all not starting. I understood that. It didn't bother me at all not playing. It bothered me that my mom was upset. But I tell you all that to tell you this. Coach caught me in the tunnel outside of the locker room after I was dressed and ready to go, and he apologized. I believe not for the not starting, but for not getting to play me on senior night. That he didn't have to do. That told me that he understood. He was following the deep subs as much as he was the starters, and I really had a lot of respect for him for that. When I went on to play as a walk-on the freshman team in college, we had a media day. So a freshman team at a Big Ten school. I think Harry Truman said that being vice president was worth about as much as a warm bucket of spit. And I think a freshman team at a Big Ten school in those days, it was the same way. And then you take a walk-on that freshman team. It might have been a cold bucket of spit. All right. So I was on the team, which I guess was a big deal, but I know that the varsity and JV coaches, Coach Butcher and Coach Nante, they came to that media day, watched us. Fortunately for us that day, the freshmen beat the varsity in a scrimmage. It was fortunate for us that day. Boy, it was tough. It was tough the next day. We got the tar beat out of us, but I remember talking to the coaches afterwards. I said, you see anybody that you're impressed with? And they said, you. I think I went 2 for 2. Guards didn't shoot in the offense that we ran. So I was used to playing under the basket in high school, and I probably got 2 tip-ins. I was just impressed that they made the trip to come and watch somebody who wasn't in the program anymore. So my memories of Coach Butcher are all positive. A lot of respect for him, and I eventually wrote a book, which they're all gone now. But as I was writing the book, I touched base with him several times, and with Coach Nante, and he was helpful in the process of writing the book, and in looking back at at what transpired in the 1970 season, the state final season, and the next year when I played, and listening to some of the radio broadcasts, Billy, I realized what a genius this guy was. I listened to a game. It would have been the sectional semifinal when I was a senior. We'd had a flu outbreak. We had 2 starters who didn't even come to the gym. Coach Butcher made some moves in that game that were just so counterintuitive. In that game, we played 5 guys for all but 45 seconds. There was one sub that came in for 45 seconds at the end of the game. We were short. You know, in the tournament, you win or go home. You know, we had to win, so he played us all the way. I was a liability early in that game. I was getting scored on underneath the basket. I think the guy I was guarding may have had 8 points in the first quarter. You've got just 5 players. You got to make them last the whole game. Coach Butcher put on a full court press the second quarter. And you think, oh my gosh, you know, he's not going to have enough players to get through this game. The full court press made the guards pick the ball up farther out. They had to make a longer pass into my man, and that longer pass was just enough longer so I could step out and intercept the pass. So if you go superficially, all of a sudden, John Olsen has a bunch of steals. Now, our guards we were in a good full court press. You know, our guards were doing a number on their guards, but more than that, our coach realized. That's what I say. He could see a minute ahead, a quarter ahead, a game ahead, a season ahead. He was just a genius. He was a long-term planning genius. He was an in-game coaching genius. So that's the short summary of my experience with Coach Butcher. Also, one of the most competitive people. You didn't want to play badminton against this guy. Coach Butcher loved to play badminton against people. If he was, and I guess one more story I'll tell you. From the time I was around the gym and he would sit down beside me from time to time and take his probably middle finger and thumb and grab either side of my leg, my thigh, just above the knee. You know how you can squeeze in there and make a person wince?
Yeah.
Okay. He did that from, a couple of times a season. He did it with everybody, I'm assuming. But I just remember that finally at the end of my senior season, he did that. And I was able to harden my muscles enough that I didn't pull away from him. And that was it was almost a rite of passage. It was like, well, gosh, it's really too late to help us, but now you're tough enough.
John, so what was it like? You're getting toward the end of your senior season. What did you want to do with your life? Where did you go to school? And then tell us about the walk-on. And I'm assuming we're talking about Indiana University. Yeah.
Well, my older sister went to IU, so that was the selection process for going to IU. That I was probably 5th or 6th grade when she went to Indiana University, so that was the only place I ever considered. My senior year in high school, I took an elective course from the B team coach, Mr. Nante, in psychology, and I knew I wanted to be a psychologist, and I could pursue that at IU. That's a whole other story. I mean, I've had a PhD now for 35 years in private practice, licensed for that amount of time. But going to IU, I thought, well, you go 4 years and you're a psychologist. I didn't realize there'd be another 4 or 5 years of graduate school. So I went to IU. I went to summer school before the regular freshman year. That turned out to be critical. It gave me a couple of extra credits. It got me used to a campus of 30,000. Being from a town of 2,500, it was nice to see the campus when it had many fewer students. But showing up that summer, being from Loogootee, I think more people called me Loogootee than called me by my name. Because IU was 50 miles away from Loogootee. Everybody knew Loogootee. Oh, state finalist team, semi-state finalist team. Everybody, and I had some confidence from my senior season. I had I don't know that this is the interview to talk about this on, but I came in with a lot of confidence playing basketball. I played a lot of pickup ball and a lot of intramural ball that summer and played quite well. And when the freshman season or freshman year of school started, I happened by luck to live on a floor in a dormitory with a guy who had been a walk-on the freshman team the year before. And he said, you should try out as a walk-on. Now, the Big Ten in those days, actually the NCAA, Lou Alcindor or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, he only played 3 years at UCLA because as a freshman he wasn't allowed to play varsity either. Kareem and I had some of those same drawbacks, Billy. So there was a separate freshman team. It actually was the last year that freshmen were ineligible, but this guy said, well, you should try out. So there was about a 6-week preseason conditioning program before the season started. And, man, I could run. I mean, we would do our calisthenics and we would do like a half-mile run down to the football stadium, and then we would run sprints on the football turf, and then we would run 104 steps up the bleachers 25 times. Hey, I was a cross-country runner. I stood out. There was only one guy who did that better than I did, and he didn't do it every time. So, again, I did what I was supposed to. I worked hard. When we'd finish all that, we'd go back to the gym. Assembly hall wasn't quite open then. It wasn't quite finished. We had a temporary floor, and we scrimmaged. This was all, no coaches. This was all preseason, and we scrimmaged. Well, I never shot. I mean, I wasn't used to being a scorer when I played. I passed, and I rebounded. We had Indiana All-Stars on that freshman team. Steve Green from Silver Creek High School. We had John Laskowski, who, we had some really good players. So I passed, and if the coaches or the players did talk about what did I do, I tried to play good defense. I passed. I wasn't a ball hog. I was a good teammate. And then the call goes out for walk-ons for the freshman team, for the both teams. Okay, we're going to have walk-ons for the teams, and I was so disappointed. All of a sudden, it's like 50 guys show up. Who didn't do any of the preseason stuff, but 50 guys show up, and wouldn't you know it, almost all of these guys had been stars on their high school teams. All right, so I put in 6 weeks being a dutiful soldier, just playing the way that I always played, and here are all these more talented guys. And you might think, well, that's bad, but it turned out to be great for me because these guys who were more talented than me, they showed it by shooting. So they showed up, and when they scrimmaged, they shot. And they shot from out. They took any shot they could get. I'm going to go way back to earlier in this interview and correct the term or define the term. I use the term garbage time. People like to think of garbage time as when your team is up 30 points and you get in, it's a chance to foul and get your name in the paper or shoot. For me, there's never been such a thing as garbage time. When you go in, you do what you're supposed to be doing if you were playing and it was a tie game. All right? That's the way I always played. That's the way I played in the preseason. And when the walk-ons showed up, that's the way I played. And these more talented walk-ons, I believe, shot their way off the team. We had good players, scholarship players. We had guys who played underneath, and this was all, Bob Knight was a first-year coach there. We had our own freshman coach, but he was one of Bob Knight's, I think, high school friends. Bob Knight did not have an offense where the guards shot. In fact, David Shepard, who was on the Carmel team that beat Loogootee in the state finals, was Mr. Basketball, was a 38-point-a-game high school scorer, was leading scorer on the freshman team. When he was a sophomore for Bob Knight, he got injured and then he got transferred. So all these guys showing up shot their way off the team, and the coaches came to me and said, well, you've made the team, but you're really not going to get much playing time. Again, you might think a person would be disappointed, but what was my position in high school? For the most part, it was you're going to play hard in practice, but you're not going to get much playing time, but you're going to get to be on the team. So it was a great experience. We traveled, we played Purdue and Illinois, and we played, I think 14 games. I can remember playing Xavier in Cincinnati. The freshman game was Xavier and IU. The varsity game was Xavier and the University of Detroit. In those days, afros were the hairstyle for black players. And the guys coming up from the University of Detroit had afros that I swear touched both sides of the narrow hallway they were coming up. It was about a 3-foot wide hallway. And I believe, and nobody knew this, as he called himself, a bald, one-eyed motor mouth. I believe Dick Vitale was the coach of that team, but nobody knew him. Nobody knew him then. So we got probably the highlight of that freshman season was we played the University of Kentucky. I don't remember whether it was in Lexington or Louisville. We played the University of Kentucky. Our freshman team played their freshman team first. They had the Mr. Basketball from Kentucky, Indiana, and either Ohio or Illinois. They had 3 Mr. Basketballs and maybe another 4 high school All-Americans, and they killed us. Oddly, 4 years later, when that freshman team, that was the 74-75 IU team, was beaten by that same group of guys in the regional final. The next year, IU went on to be undefeated national champs. But so we ran into those guys again. But the varsity game, the nice thing about the freshman team, we sat in folding chairs underneath one of the baskets for the varsity game, and I believe Steve Downing had something in the neighborhood of 40 points and 25 rebounds, and IU upset Kentucky at Kentucky. So I got to be in a great program, and more to the point, I wanted to be a psychologist. Bob Knight always said in basketball, but I would maintain in anything, the mental is to the physical as 4 is to 1 or 5 is. It's much more mental than anything else.
Right.
He talked about achieving your potential, and there was no way I wasn't going to go on to get my PhD and be a psychologist after playing for Coach Butcher and Coach Knight. It just, however long it takes and however you have to do it, you accomplish what you want to accomplish. I talk about it as force of will. I tell people, when you're told no, sometimes the person telling you no doesn't have the authority to tell you yes, or they're telling you no, not at this time. But I think through force of will, you can accomplish just about anything. And that is what I took from high school basketball. I have often said I benefit more from high school basketball in comparison to what I contributed to it. I benefit more than I think anybody else in history, because it taught me a mindset. It taught me understanding people. It taught me motivating, dealing with disappointment, minimizing your weaknesses, accentuating your strengths, mental discipline. And just to get on a soapbox, part of the reason I wrote a book was my dismay at adult involvement in kids' sports. Adults doing this, I don't think that Coach Butcher ever really yelled at our guards as they were bringing the ball up court. I didn't yell at them every play to tell them what to think. And Coach Knight was famous for never calling a timeout in a close situation with a few seconds left, when more vain coaches call a timeout and drop a special play. Coach Knight's belief was, we've covered everything mentally in practice that you need to know. We're going to have to inbound the ball again if I call a timeout. It's not a good time to teach, in this situation. And that's what those guys taught me is to think for yourself. I'm doing this interview from my truck outside of high school. I just spent a half an hour with a student I'm mentoring, and part of what I'm doing with him goes back to those coaches. I'm getting him to understand how much he is thinking for himself, and the benefits of thinking for himself, and more ways he can think for himself and control his own life instead of resenting possibly parents and adults controlling his life. That's what I got from those coaches.
And so I apologize. You are Dr. Olsen.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, I got that for me. I actually got it for a couple people. To be a psychologist in Indiana at private practice level, you have to have your PhD. So that was part of it. The other reason that I got a PhD is I found myself in certain situations where that just impressed the heck out of some people. If I was just John Olsen, it wouldn't really impress them much, but that I'm Dr. Olsen, I've got people who use my title more than I do, who will only introduce me as this is Dr. Olsen, this, that, and the other. So, it's useful in those situations, but it was just a necessary requirement to being what I wanted to be. And because of those coaches and fulfilling my potential, I've been able to work 35 years at a job that I love. I've had a lot of say in what I could do. I've made good money at it. And you know, to me, this is a psychologist talking. High school sports are a microcosm of the world. A microcosm means small world. High school sports to me are set up to present all of the opportunities and challenges that you'll get throughout your life. And if adults would leave kids the heck alone and let them sort out their squabbles, you know, shoot free throws, and whoever hits the most, they get the ball out, or, you know, argue, or whatever it happens to be, you know, draft or pick their own teams for pickup ball. If adults would stay out of the way, kids would learn how to deal with the sports world and be much more ready for the real world. I think one of the problems of starting sports so very early is you have too many adults involved with too much of the mental aspect for the kids. Again, here's the psychologist in me looking at a soccer practice when kids are, you know, under the age of 8. And you know what that looks like. You've got a ball and you've got 12 kids within 3 feet of it all kicking. And then you've got an adult saying, you guys, don't you understand spacing? And the psychologist in me wants to say, no, they're cognitively incapable of understanding spacing. They're egocentric. They can't take another person's perspective, and it won't be until they're 8 or 9 that they'll understand spacing. All right? So another one that is not Coach Knight's fault, but Coach Knight had what people like to call a fiery personality. He was a genius. He was a basketball genius. He taught us things and showed us things in practice that nobody else seemed to understand. What people recognized more was his temper, his yelling. And so you had generations of coaches who started yelling at kindergartners and yelling all the way through and throwing temper tantrums. And I'm not apologizing for the coach. His behavior was out of control at times, and the way he tried to make a point, he could have made his points better. But you ended up having people emulating him who didn't understand how smart he was, didn't understand the mental aspects of the game, just understood, well, we can motivate him by yelling at him and so on and so forth, and ruin the sport for a lot of kids. And then there was a backlash where parents felt their kids were being verbally abused and they had to get involved. And now I just see that there are a lot of kids who would never be satisfied being a deep sub and not playing. They'd have a parent at home griping like crazy, and my dad was reading a book or fishing, and my mom was just enjoying that I was on the team. So it's a different game in that respect. But like I said, I think I got more out of basketball for having contributed less than anybody that I know.
You know, for the past 1 hour and 7 minutes, I feel like I've been on your couch. This has been an amazing interview, and I thank you for your time.
Hey, if you ever want to do a follow-up, there's more. You know, I mean, the senior season itself, which is kind of what the book was written about growing up in a small town, but the senior season itself was about perseverance and sticking with things. Anyway, it's I haven't been watching the clock. I'm famous for saying I've just got one more story. In fact, I did a short article for the. I had this distinction, Billy. I don't have it anymore. But at one time, I was the only person in state history to play in the programs of the all-time winningest high school coach.
Wow. Yep. And
the winningest college coach. Now, yeah. Coach Butcher's recently been surpassed by J.R. Holmes at Bloomington South High School. But I walked into the high school Basketball Hall of Fame in Newcastle one day, told the receptionist, asked her if she knew the answer to that trivia question. You'd think it would be somebody famous. But it was me. And before I left, the director of the Hall of Fame called me in. We told stories. I ended up writing an article for their magazine, and I believe the title of the article was Just One More Story, because I'd tell just one more, he'd have just one more. So when I wrote my book, I dictated it. I can't write as fast as I can think or talk. And people said, well, just kind of what you said. You know, it's just like having a conversation with you. So I've appreciated it. I've got to say, for a guy who has no more basketball credentials than me. I've talked at basketball banquets. I've written a book. I've been in newspaper articles. Now this radio interview. It's amazing to me how much people in general, people in Indiana especially, value every aspect, no matter how seemingly small, of Indiana high school basketball.